Hi, my name is Arati and I'm a journalist at MediaNama. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the research presentations for the 2022 cohort of the Meta India Tech Scholars. Meta launched the program to provide a research and mentorship platform to law students who are keen to engage on contemporary questions of technology, law, and policy. The law firm Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas Co is supporting the program as a knowledge partner. Through this series, the scholars will show us how specific policy choices in the technology sector influence and impact India's tryst with the internet. For today's showcase, I'm delighted to introduce you to Isha. Isha is currently an associate at Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas in Bombay. Having recently graduated from NALSAR University of Law, Hyderabad, Isha holds a passion for tech law and policy and is also an enthusiast of alternative dispute resolution. She's written several papers and won several international and national competitions in the field as well. Thank you so much for being here, Isha, and really look forward to hearing about your presentation on the regulation of OTTs under telecom laws, which thankfully I think companies have managed to escape for now. So look forward to hearing from you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aarti. Thank you for your kind introduction. And just want to, before I begin with my presentation, I'd like to thank Meta and the entire team at Meta, as well as the entire team at SAM and my mentors as well at the Dialogue for helping me write this paper and for being so supportive and helping me with a lot of guidance throughout the entire phase of the scholarship. So huge thank you to them for this entire process. Without further ado, I'd just like to jump into my to presenting what my paper was about. Thank you, Aarti. So the paper essentially speaks about the same service, same rules debate. It's an analysis of the regulation of traditional telecom service providers at par with OTT communication platforms. It was an important paper for me to write, especially in light of the debate surrounding the regulatory burdens that were going to be imposed on OTT communication platforms in the upcoming Telecom Act of India. And without further ado, I just want to get straight into the paper. The research questions that I mainly focused on in my paper was number one, whether or not TSPs and OTTs provide the same services in the first place. Because the question of whether or not they should be regulated at par with each other begins with this. Are they even providing the same service for us to say that the same rules must apply on both of them? And in order to examine whether or not the same services were being provided, I went into broadly the structural and the functional differences between both of the services, as well as the policy and market perspective on the consequences of having the same rules and the same regulations for both OTTs and for TSPs. A cross-jurisdictional comparison between India, the EU, and the US was also very helpful in my research because it's interesting to see that how are other countries, especially other countries with leading technologies, dealing with this question, right? Because OTTs versus TSPs is not a debate is that only the Indian regulatory landscape is seeing, and it helps to look outwards sometimes to get guidance on how it is that other countries are dealing with these issues. So it's interesting to see the regulatory landscape in other countries, some case laws from other countries, and finally, in my paper, I address certain jurisdictional issues in regulating the OTT communication apps under the telecom sector in India and what the consequences of that would look like. The debate essentially first spoke about the erstwhile proposed telecom bill, the perspective of telecos on the bill and on this entire debate, and why it is that they have been lobbying and pushing for regulation of OTTs at par with their regulatory burdens, the potential harms of conflating the two, and also questions of substitutability. Because, like I said before, if the two aren't substitutable, then it makes no sense to regulate them at par, and it makes no sense to make the claim that they are the same service. And finally, I spoke about content versus carriage, essentially the debate between looking at OTTs. OTTs as the ends, and TSPs as the means. So these are broadly some of the issues that I spoke about in my paper. First, I'd like to go into the technical and functional differences between the two. Because if we are to claim that they are providing the same services, a deeper dive is required into what these services are and whether or not they are essentially the same. In terms of technical differences, there's a very big difference between the functions that an OTT has versus the services that are provide the infrastructure that's required for TSPs. The biggest technical difference, I think, comes from network infrastructure. I think that the network infrastructure that is required for a TSP to operate is vastly different and operates in a very different mechanism than OTTs. Network infrastructure for TSPs include a wide variety of physical infrastructure, whereas there is only independency on internet and IP based protocols for OTTs. When it comes to connectivity, the debate, the difference essentially is between real time communication versus which is what TSPs rely on through their vast network infrastructure, as opposed to OTTs who rely and build upon this network infrastructure that TSPs provide, and then rely on bandwidth availability and data quality through the internet. There are differences, lots of technical differences in terms of communication protocols. For example, OTTs, TSPs, my bad, operate on SS7 versus OTTs who operate over IP. The service architecture itself is very different. Service architecture for OTTs essentially works in a very distributed manner across the internet and doesn't have boundaries, doesn't have physical boundaries, whereas the service architecture for maintenance and upkeep of the services provided by TSPs and the network that they provide relies very heavily on physical infrastructure and the maintenance and upkeep of that. Of course, at the end, there's also the difference between device and platform independence, wherein OTTs have the independence of devices, they have the independence of platforms, whereas TSPs do not necessarily have that independence. And the next thing I'd like to point out is the functional differences. The functional differences between the two are very, very varied. While TSPs serve as communication modes over voice and SMS, the functions that a OTT platform may have in today's day and age with all of the advancing technology could be a wider variety than just providing SMS and voice calling services. Multimedia sharing is something that especially is picking up, and the types and the variety of multimedia sharing that we are now seeing over OTT platforms, whether it's your WhatsApp, whether it's Instagram, whether it's Microsoft Teams, is very different, and the scope of those services is very different than merely providing voice and SMS connectivity and text connectivity, which is what TSPs are providing. The cost structure, of course, because the services are so varied, the cost structure also varies a lot, wherein TSPs rely on usage-based costing, and that's how they earn their income, as opposed to OTTs, who may seem free and who do not charge direct fees from consumers in most instances, but rather rely on indirect costing. The reach and coverage, of course, is also very varied for OTTs and TSPs. While TSPs aim to provide a way wider reach to everybody, the services and the reach of OTTs is very internet reliant and is on an opt-in basis, wherein you would opt to buy data packs, you would opt to enable those data packs, would opt to connect to a Wi-Fi or to connect to data in order to use those services. Whereas for something like a TSP, the regular network that is provided, the usage is way more wide-reaching. There's also the difference between cross-platform and network compatibility. But I think the most fundamental difference, and the difference that sums up all of the technical and functional differences between the two, is the debate is the method of looking at TSPs as a means and OTTs as an end to those means. While and the reason I say this is because OTTs cannot function without the network infrastructure and the technical support that is provided by traditional telecom service providers. Unless telecom service providers have the reach that they do and have the basic internet connectivity, OTTs cannot operate individually on their own. And so to say that the two services are the same would imply that they are substitutable, which they are not because of how heavily OTTs rely on TSPs. So traditional TSPs, I would argue in my paper, provide the underlying technology, which is the means over which OTT communication platforms operate, and which I would call the ends to those means. Without telecom service providers and without telecom operators, OTTs cannot operate, which is why I feel that they are not substitutable services. And coming to the potential harms of regulating them at par, if they are at some point in the future brought back within the Telecom Act, the regulatory burden that is imposed or that would be imposed on them would be far more would have far more consequences than anticipated at the time of the bill, right? Because the regulatory burden on an OTT is more than just the burden that is being imposed by the telecom sector. There are cross jurisdictional challenges, and this is something I speak about at length in the later half of my paper as well, where I talk about the cross jurisdictional challenges with OTTs being regulated not just by the telecom sector but also by concerns of the IT Act of as well as other acts in the country that impose a lot of regulatory burdens on the OTTs. And these kind of heavy regulations, these kind of heavy impositions of compliances would ultimately lead to barriers of entry, especially for smaller startups, especially for smaller OTT communication apps and platforms that cannot afford simply to pay the same amount to comply with the same amount of regulatory burdens, even if there is no requirement of paying licensing fees at par with other TSPs. And the impact of startups and the technological growth that would have on would be very far reaching. There are, of course, censorship concerns as well, wherein we see that an increased regulation of OTTs would also mean that the data privacy that we now enjoy, the current end-to-end encryption, all of that is coming into question, especially if the telecom sector and TRAI gets into regulating very heavily and very into in regulating uh, OTTs very heavily. Of course, there's going to be a far reaching impact on innovation, given that the costs might drive out competition, might impact consumer choices with the prices of using these services going up. And finally, technological convergence is something that regulators need to be very careful of, because imposing rigid and regulations based on outdated understandings of what exactly OTTs provide and what it is exactly that TSPs provide would lead to a lot of confusion in the law. And the problem is that, especially with regulating something over the internet, technology keeps changing, it keeps evolving, and if the law does not keep up with it, which it can't, laws can't keep changing with each new technology and each new change, each new advancement in the OTT sector, it would lead to outdated laws being imposed on new technologies. I think moving on to the cross jurisdictional comparison, I think it's interesting to note how other countries have been dealing with this debate of same services, same rules, and the regulation of OTTs. Especially interesting is the United Kingdom and the EU and how they deal with it. I think that the difference that they bring about is between number based and number independent services. So OTTs come under number independent services, whereas number-based services are traditional telecom service providers. And the way that they are regulated in the UK and the EU is that number independent services do not have to match the regulatory compliances of number-based services. Of course, there are some rules that apply to them as well, especially in terms of non-discrimination or consumer privacy, or when it comes to emergency services. These are rules that are applied even on OTT communication apps. But except for that, the regulatory landscape does not impose very high burdens on number independent services. And that is reflective in the number of technological advancements we've seen, especially even if you talk about the advancements in technologies that we've seen in the US. I briefly also mentioned the evolution of law through certain case laws, whereas in the Gmail case, the courts had held that Gmail should not be regulated at par, whereas in the Skype out case, wherein the question is whether or not Skype should be regulated at par with TSPs. The courts actually went into the details of each and every service provided by Google and by Skype to differentiate whether or not there is indeed the same kind of service being provided. And I think that this case by case analysis should really help us in trying to figure out and trying to draw inspiration from the details of technological and network based differences, functional differences that the courts have pointed out for each and every different service that OTTs provide. In the US as well, there are, of course, impositions in terms of data privacy. However, TSPs and OTT services are not equated for regulation purposes, and we do see a lot of innovation in terms of because as a result of less stringent regulation. Finally, coming to the recommendations that I have, overall, the recommendation that I would like to, that I see reflected in which is a happy surprise for all of us that have been writing about this, that have been researching on this, is that instead of including OTT communication apps under the ambit of the Telecom Act in India, we should instead carve out perhaps and carve out different acts or update already existing regulations in order to cover regulation of OTTs. And instead of bringing the regulations for OTTs at par with traditional telecom service providers, it is rather recommended that traditional service providers reduce the burdens on them are reduced. So that's essentially the gist of my paper. Of course, with the latest developments in the sector, it's a good news for everyone who's been following the debate of same service versus same rules very closely, because the government has decided not to regulate OTTs at par with traditional service providers.
All right, thank you so much for that, Isha. And I think it's a good summary of all the concerns that OTTs had and even TSPs had, to be fair. So for anyone who's trying to understand, okay, why did the telecom bill evolve the way it did, this can help give them a really good grasp of, what the larger arena was looking like. So thank you for that. Now, in your concluding slide, you kind of spoke about reducing the burdens on TSPs. So instead of upping the regulation for everyone else, we need to balance it out and sort of uh, give them the benefit of doubt as well. So I know you've said you've mentioned this in your paper. So could you just give us an idea of like what those regulatory burdens are and how they can be reduced? And my assumption, to be the devil's advocate, is always that these burdens are there to protect consumers, to protect competition. So would your recommendations impact either of those objectives? Just curious to know.
Right. I think like one of the biggest concerns of the TSPs and the reason why they were lobbying for OTTs to be brought at par with TSPs was that their claim was if why is it that OTTs, even though they provide voice calling services and SMS services, they are not being asked to pay spectrum fees. They are not being asked to contribute to government funds with regards to promotion of the telecom industry, especially to consumers in remote sectors. And I think that one of the biggest concerns for them is the costing that has been imposed on them, especially in terms of auctions of spectrum. So I think that the biggest suggestion that comes to mind, and what I have suggested in the paper as well, is to increase the spectrum tenure. Number one, in future auctions, increase the tenure for each spectrum from 20 to 30 years. Perhaps even surrender of spectrum to be could be permitted after 10 years for spectrum acquired in future auctions. No spectrum usage charge. That is also an idea that perhaps would reduce the burden and the of compliances and the costing for telecom sectors, for traditional telecom service providers in India. And some another idea, and we're happy to see that some of these ideas have been reflected in the act as well. Whereas another idea is that spectrum sharing could be encouraged. An additional maybe SUC of 0.5% of spectrum sharing has been removed in the act, which is really encouraging, I think, to TSPs, and would perhaps help them look at the regulatory landscape in a new light instead of lobbying for OTTs to be brought at par. And these are services that these are changes, I think, that would not impact the end use consumers, especially because with regards to spectrum costing, that would not impact consumers in the way that they are being charged or they are being affected in terms of the services and the network that they get from TSPs.
All right, great. Thank you for that. And I just have one more question. So I don't want to interrogate you too much on what's happened because that's in the past now. But I'm sort of curious as to what you see the future for OTT regulation looking like. It's clear it's not happening under the telecom bill for now. But what do you think that the ideal way forward for these platforms is, given all the concerns that you mentioned and, the kind of unique characteristics that they have? How can they be ideally regulated? Should we have a new law that comes in to regulate them? Can existing laws be applied to kind of create a cohesive framework? How do you see it?
Right. Thank you for that question. I think it's the coming years will be very interesting, especially in light of not just OTT communication apps, but how it is that all OTT platforms are going to be regulated, whether it's in terms of communication and telecom, or whether it's the media and entertainment sector. So I do think that existing laws, like I had mentioned, perhaps would not be the most ideal. An amendment of these existing laws would perhaps not be the most ideal way of going around of regulating OTTs, especially because each of these acts have been brought in to regulate a specific sector, and they have been brought in with in keeping in mind that specific sector and the challenges and the technology involved in that specific sector, which is why I think that while other acts, including the Telecom Act, the IT Act, the Digital India Act, while all of these need to be amended in order for them to keep up with the changes in the telecom landscape, especially with regards to OTT. Separate regulations for OTTs, keeping in mind the specific fact scenario and the specific conditions that apply to OTTs, would perhaps be the right way forward.
All right. Well, that's something for policymakers to think about amongst the many other laws that they're rejigging currently. Thank you so much for your time, Isha. This was a really great presentation. And if you'd like to learn more about Isha's work or any of the scholars participating in this year's cohort, please head on over to MediaNama's website or our YouTube channel to learn more about their research on tech policy in India. Thanks once again.
Thank you, Aarti. Thank you. Thanks for taking out the time for this.